Hello, friends, welcome back to my channel. And wow! What a time to be living in Canada right now, it's like watching a slow-motion economic car crash, right? There's turmoil in more than just our hearts. Today, we're diving headfirst into the economic abyss triggered by the recent dramatic resignation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Yep, Trudeau is gone, and the Canadian economy, frankly, might be close to joining him in exile. What a mess. Totally predictable, though. We're in for a massive, all-encompassing overhaul of the so-called progressive policies that Trudeau built his legacy on. Spoiler alert, his grand ideas have led us directly toward an economic abyss. But wait. Don't just take my word for it. Let's get into the numbers, the causes, the consequences, and why Canada, once celebrated for its prosperity and stability, is now on the verge of one of the most dramatic economic recessions in modern history. And, folks, it's not just Canada anymore. This kind of political and economic mess is happening all over the world. Surprised? You shouldn't be. Let's talk more about it. Let's start by taking a good look at Trudeau's key policies during his tenure: record immigration, ballooning government spending, and his green agenda. These were supposed to create a utopia of inclusion, sustainability, and resilient growth. But guess what? That utopia has now turned into a dystopia, because these well-intentioned, unbalanced policies went completely off the economic rails. One of the most talked about and controversial aspects of Trudeau's legacy is his extreme push for high immigration. Now don't get me wrong, immigration can be a powerful economic engine. However, it needs to be managed with precision. What did Trudeau do instead? He treated immigration policy as an endless tap to keep pouring cheap labor into the economy without any consideration for the strains on housing, jobs, and infrastructure. Right now in Canada, you've got serious housing shortages and astronomical rent hikes. It's almost as if the government didn't realize that these newcomers would eventually need places to live. Shocking, right? Let's get into some numbers here. Since the pandemic ended, Canada has seen population growth explode to an unprecedented 3.5%. This sounds like a positive indicator, but what happens when you pour millions of people into a housing market that's already suffocating? I'll tell you what happens: disaster. In fact, over the past year, rent across major cities in Canada skyrocketed by 25 to 30%, and purchasing a home now feels like chasing a mirage for young people. Trudeau's policy of accelerating immigration to stimulate economic growth completely broke the housing market. In Montreal, in fact, rents have surged by 40% since 2020. Can you imagine? And it's not just real estate. Genuine job opportunities are disappearing, while new entrants to the labor force are desperately competing for fewer positions. There's a reason why unemployment has steadily risen to nearly 6.6%, with no sign of stopping. Young Canadians entering the workforce are looking around and realizing there's nothing left for them. What was touted as the panacea of immigration turned out to be a key factor strangling the economy. And Canadians? Yeah, they've noticed. Public support for immigration has nosedived. This was, after all, a country that celebrated its multicultural inclusivity. For the first time since the late 1990s, more Canadians than not say immigration levels are simply too high. It's a major turnaround. Trust me, when immigration becomes this unpopular in a country that once prided itself on open borders and acceptance, you know things have hit rock bottom. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room: government spending. Trudeau expanded Canada's social safety net, which sounds pretty caring and thoughtful, right? Child benefit checks, subsidized daycare, and let's not forget the piece de resistance, the National Dental Plan. Lovely. Except these programs weren't cheap, and someone has to foot the bill. The Canadian government saw its federal debt double since Trudeau took office in 2015. We're talking a federal debt that now sits at 1.24 trillion Canadian dollars, or about $870 billion US dollars. Think about that. Canada's debt has ballooned so dramatically that it's now a threat to both economic stability and generational prosperity. Trudeau seemed to forget that budgets don't balance themselves, no matter how eloquently you phrase it. During the pandemic, the generous support payments sent to businesses and households seemed justifiable in the short term. However, post-COVID, Trudeau's government kept filling the money cannon, launching new permanent spending measures, instead of scaling back. And here's the kicker: as inflation spiked, the government barely blinked. Interest rates shot through the roof, and suddenly that $1.24 trillion debt wasn't looking so manageable anymore. Rising bond yields mean that Canada will soon face much higher costs to service its debt. Analysts from the Bank of Canada have warned that debt servicing costs could increase by over 50% by 2030, leaving less money for basic public services. We're mortgaging the future here. That's no exaggeration. And what about Trudeau's obsession with climate policies and social programs? They've also been throwing more and more money into a green dream that's left Canadian industries struggling to stay competitive. The carbon tax, another pet project, was designed to create a more eco-friendly economy by taxing large energy producers. Yet what it seems to have done is just drive costs up for consumers, while many oil-producing regions, which rely heavily on resource extraction, felt the economic hit hard. Speaking of carbon taxes and the environment, let's look at the so-called green ambitions of Trudeau's government, which have become one of the biggest points of contention. Of course, taking action against climate change is critical, but not when you handicap entire industries without having a solid alternative ready. You cannot just slap taxes on industries that produce most of your economy, especially in an oil-rich nation like Canada, without consequences. Trudeau tried to transition Canada into a new, green era, but his policies seemed to ignore the realities on the ground in favor of idealism. For instance, Canada's carbon price will rise to 170 Canadian dollars per ton by 2030 from 65 Canadian dollar today, a move that is intended to spur green innovation. But what about short-term economic stability? The oil and gas industry accounts for 6% of Canada's GDP and nearly 300,000 jobs that are now on the chopping block. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, of course, is positioning himself as the anti-Trudeau by focusing on increasing energy production and scrapping these high taxes. Surprise, surprise, this resonates with voters, especially in oil-dependent provinces like Alberta. But even beyond a carbon tax, this relentless push toward electric vehicles, renewable energy, and tighter regulations on emissions has Canada's resource sector reeling. Canada is the world's fourth largest oil producer, and remember, it's not just Canada using that oil, it's US demand driving the trade as well. In fact, over 4 million barrels per day of Canadian crude are exported to the United States. That's big business. Yet, under Trudeau's green policies, the sector has been suffocated with regulations and taxes, all while the rest of the world kept demanding more of exactly what we were taxing into oblivion. Now, inflation. Let's not mince words, inflation is a government killer. What really did in Trudeau wasn't just bad economic choices in the abstract. It was inflation, plain and simple. Nothing erodes public confidence like the everyday pain of higher prices and shrinking paychecks. And what was once seen as transitory by politicians became the single greatest threat Trudeau's administration faced. Remember, inflation in Canada reached as high as 8% during parts of 2022, levels not seen in nearly 4 decades. But it wasn't just a blip, higher than normal inflation persisted into 2023, compounded by rising interest rates. The Bank of Canada's policy to aggressively hike rates meant mortgage payments, rents, and consumer loans all shot up, squeezing Canadians in every direction. Yet wages couldn't keep up. In fact, the real wage growth rate in 2023 stagnated, lagging behind inflation, which meant that Canadians were effectively getting poorer with each passing month. Basic necessities like groceries have become downright unaffordable for many. The price of food in Canada has consistently risen by a double-digit percentage over the past 2 years, pushing more and more households closer to the poverty line. Here's an example: the price of dairy products increased by 13.4% in 2023 alone, while fresh fruit and vegetables saw rises of 9.3%. Rapid inflation ate through the safety nets, benefits, and even the wage adjustments that Trudeau's government had championed in prior years. And when people cannot afford bacon or milk anymore, they do care who's in charge and how the heck things got so bad. Trudeau's Liberal government might have started with well-meaning optimism. Remember when everyone was fawning over him during his first term, but in the end, his vindication for resignation wasn't just political maneuvering, it was a real referendum on how the economy has made life worse for a significant chunk of the population. Pierre Poilievre is now riding high on a conservative platform that promises to undo many of Trudeau's policies, especially the carbon tax and green agenda, in an effort to bring Canada back to pro-business, pro-energy policies. As the country braces for an upcoming early election, predictions suggest that Poilievre's Conservatives are likely to win by a landslide. It's not just because Trudeau is out of the picture, but because a huge swath of Canadians have voted with their wallets, and what they're saying is that Trudeau's progressive utopia was far too costly. And the political reset happening in Canada? Get ready, it's not just there. Economists and political observers are watching ripple effects take shape all over the world. We've seen it with other ruling parties facing voter wrath over inflation, higher interest rates, and cost of living crises. Inflation isn't red or blue, it swallows any government unwilling to deal with it head-on. We saw it across Europe and the Americas. And now, with Trump back in the White House, yes, the same Trump who helped ignite the populist uprising in 2016, expect more protectionism, more American-first trade policies, and direct confrontation as Poilievre's Canada looks to assert itself. Make no mistake, Trudeau's fall isn't just a Canadian problem, it mirrors a global trend that I bet we'll keep seeing in the years ahead. From the far-right populist surge in Europe to dissatisfaction with progressive policies in the US, this moment crosses borders, folks. The economy is the great leveler, and when that starts collapsing, so does trust in establishment politics. And it's not just inflation. Across the globe, governments are struggling with similar issues: disrupted supply chains, energy insecurity, crumbling middle classes, and high interest rates that make tackling sovereign debt nearly impossible. You know how the saying goes, when you're in debt, and the rates are high, you're at the mercy of lenders. Well, Canada isn't isolated in this fiscal quagmire. Countries like the UK, Italy, and Spain are all struggling with volatile political environments fueled by economic pain. We've seen social unrest akin to what we're seeing in France, where inflation and pension reforms sparked widespread protests. Voters are getting angrier, and different parties are being punished because no one seems to have a real plan to fix the problem long-term. Sound familiar? Trudeau's mixed approach of increasing immigration, expanding government spending, and pushing aggressive climate initiatives has made both voters and businesses turn away. Whether it's the housing market crunch, the skyrocketing cost of living, or collapsing public confidence, voters are ready for a change. And while Poilievre seems poised to take advantage of this transition, it's not all roses for the next leader of the country. With mounting debt, an increasingly globalized populist resistance, and the looming specter of Trump-era tariffs, Canada has entered the most uncertain economic period it's seen in decades. But don't be fooled into thinking Canada's problem is Canada's issue alone. The stage is set for a global political shift as well, where progressive politics may continue to face backlash from those fed up with rising costs, rising migration, and what they perceive as governments that have lost touch with their concerns. What comes after Trudeau won't fix everything overnight, and Trudeau's downfall may just be a harbinger of what's to come in other parts of the world. So, thanks for tuning in to today's analysis, my friends. What do you think? Will Poilievre be the savior Canada is looking for? Or will populist policies provide nothing more than temporary red meat for a hungry electorate? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and hit that like button if you agree that we need to keep talking about these urgent economic issues more often. And as always, remember folks, it's your money, your future, and you deserve to know where it's going.